After exploring Count Cortus's concerns and delving into the minute details of what he knew of events in the Empire, Ludmilla retired to her room to ponder the Wyvernmark's state of affairs. Though it may have been by the Sorcerer King's command, she could only attribute the specifics of what was going on to the machinations of the Prime Minister of the Sorceress Kingdom, Albedo. To call them machinations cast events in a sinister light, but she could find no more concise way to summarize everything. Lady Shaltir occasionally shared her thoughts on Lady Albedo's character, and what Ludmilla noted of the Prime Minister's work suggested that everything her liege said about her was accurate. If there was such a thing as a supreme bureaucrat, Lady Albedo would be that person. This, however, left certain hallmarks in her work that always suggested that she managed the Sorceress Kingdom from behind a desk. Much like Nonna, her head administrative aide in Warden's Vale, or rather than like Nonna, the elder liches of His Majesty's administration had been trained by Lady Albedo. This led many of the nobles of the Sorceress Kingdom to eventually recognize which policies, missives and processes were wrought by their Prime Minister's hand before needing to authenticate them. All things were qualified, quantified, verified, analyzed and then subjected to various formulations to produce the desired ends in a manner previously inconceivable, and still mostly irreplicable, to the regional administrators. That the realm achieved those desired ends, however, was contingent on the machinery of the nation operating as they did in Lady Albedo's calculations, which they often did not. It was the task of the Sorceress Kingdom's nobility, guilds and the administration's staff to ensure that the specifications of that machinery were kept as up to date as possible so that the royal court could make the most effective domestic policy decisions possible. Lady Shaltir once told her that a catastrophe would occur should Lady Albedo's schemes one day fly apart, but the Prime Ministers seemed abundantly aware that, even with a swarm of elder liches assisting with administrative processes, their information would always be imperfect and the plans that relied on that information were similarly so. Thus, Lady Albedo had come to accept that a certain amount of wiggle room was required when dealing with things in practice. She did her best to keep that wiggle minimal, however, but many members of the House of Lords wondered at what point that wiggle would no longer be considered a wiggle and what would happen when that happened. And it had to happen, eventually. Whether the source of such a disturbance was foreign or domestic, the world had a way of inevitably shaking things up. One such unacceptable wiggle seemed imminent in the Wyvernmark and, unfortunately for the Empire, they did not have the excellent cross-departmental processes as the Sorceress Kingdom. Albedo's control over the Empire only went so far as influencing overarching legislation, broad policy decisions and specific requests that nudged the numbers, painting her picture of the Sorceress Kingdom's client state in what she considered favorable directions. This was precisely what she had done to push the Wyvernmark into its present circumstances. Still, Ludmilla wasn't certain that Lady Albedo would be particularly displeased with any result. Much like the operation in the blister, the events precipitated in the Wyvernmark was something like an experimental scenario to be evaluated by the Sorceress Kingdom's agents. The Empire's Court Council would report its top-down perspective to the Royal Court of the Sorceress Kingdom. Ludmilla was present as a liaison officer to observe the conduct of the military and the territorial administrators, and it would be foolish to believe that others weren't working unseen to collect data for a comprehensive assessment. Of particular interest to Ludmilla and likely everyone awaiting the results in the Sorceress Kingdom was how the Empire planned to test the limits of the lease agreement for the Death Series servitors assigned to domestic security. The work with the Second Legion not only provided valuable insight on how the Undead could be integrated with a nation's military to maximal effect, but also suggested how a nation might behave when they acquired Death Series servitors from the Sorceress Kingdom. As with individuals regardless of wealth or strata, power had a way of revealing the character of a nation. It was the Empire's character that now weighed heavily on Ludmilla as she prepared for her second assignment. As she had described to General Carbane and Commander Enns, that character was decidedly human as far as the average human of the region went, which meant that they imposed human order on their surroundings. Within their political constituencies, the problem was not that they did so, but the foundations upon which that order was built. The true reason why human nations in the region enjoyed security enough to prosper was not due to their own efforts, but because of the intervention of the slain theocracy. This intervention was usually subtle, consisting of unseen efforts at stymieing non-human development before said non-humans became a problem to nearby human states. They would also deploy forces to eliminate targets that represented imminent existential threats to large human populations. As far as it seemed, The Empire was not aware of the efforts of the theocracy's scriptures, so Ludmilla could only assume that the scriptures only collaborated with fellow members of the faith as they had with House Zaradnik. This ignorance led to the belief that the Empire was solely responsible for its envious position as the top human nation outside of the slain theocracy. While others had a hand in its development, the Empire was ultimately a nation built on false assumptions about the truth of the world. If put to the test by a truly advanced and powerful opponent without the protection of the slain theocracy, or now, the Sorceress Kingdom, they would be found woefully wanting. Because they believed themselves above all others, the world was theirs for the taking. Cooperation was an afterthought, and the idea that the first truly advanced and powerful state that they encountered might mercilessly crush them for their blindness did not enter into their thoughts at all. Other races were simply savages and did not merit the same rights and considerations that humans did, and other human nations were considered quaint, backwards or weak. The slain theocracy was afforded the barest of grudging respect, and even then Imperial citizens rationalized the difference as an advantage enjoyed only because of their head start. They did not understand how vast the void between themselves and other nations could be, which was especially ironic since the Sorceress Kingdom was their suzerain. The Empire's Overlord did not count toward the Imperial worldview, instead considered along the same lines as a force of nature or a powerful monster. Ludmilla's observations and thoughts would be included in her report to the royal court, but, for now, she had duties to carry out. They were accompanied by many lines that were still blurred or completely undefined, but she could at least begin with her immediate priorities. How things had played out thus far and continued to play out showed every indication that she was being used, but being used was not necessarily a bad thing. There was honor in service, and there was no greater honor than to serve her sovereign and her god. Early the following morning, Ludmilla brought her cavalry squad into courts, much to the dismay of its citizens. The count insisted on accompanying them, followed by a half-dozen of his footmen. Also present was the captain of the company on garrison duty with a dozen of his men, as well as a gaggle of priests and acolytes from the town's temple. They stayed well away from the Death Series servitors, trailing behind and following from the sides of the main avenue. Ludmilla walked alongside Baron Ward, leading their mounts at the head of the column of undead and gauging the reactions of the citizenry. They emptied the thoroughfare well ahead of her passage, disappearing into side streets, alleys and storefronts. Men, women and children looked out fearfully from the shadows of the buildings and through cracks in the shuttered windows above at the column of darkly armored figures gleaming in the early morning light. It was a scene that she was all too familiar with. "I wonder if it will always start like this," Ludmilla muttered. "When does it stop being like this, my lady?" Baron Ward asked. "That depends on the people," she answered, "and it also depends on the local leaders. Erantle had hundreds of Death Series servitors and elder liches working in the city, and even more powerful undead besides. I first got a handle on things, as you put it, in that situation. Either way, the people will get used to it. The city of Erantle just needed a bit of a push." Lord Ward grunted, nodding his head slowly. "It may be that this will work to Lord Cortez's benefit, but the timing is still poor. Many of the Sorceress Kingdom's nobles are still easing their subjects into their new reality," Ludmilla said. "According to our Prime Minister, it will take the whole Duchy of Erantle another 5 years to fully acclimate. This is not just due to the undead, however, but also from the integration of our demi-human populations and the effect that the new administration and its policies have on internal politics. Considering this, it's not a problem if you employ a similarly gradual approach with your civilians. What is immediately required by the royal court, however, is that the undead security forces are positioned to respond to threats. Leaving them hidden in the middle of nowhere is unacceptable." "How did the Second Legion do it?" "They fought a small war together with the Death Series servitors," Ludmilla smirked. "General Carbane said that earning the trust of the Imperial Army is the key to the integration of the least security forces. The citizens trust the army, and the army can help to establish the new normal. Hopefully, we can skip the war part." Her ragged breathing and the sound of rapid steps drew Ludmilla's attention to the entrance of an alley they had just passed. "Yee art." A man dashed out into the morning light, longsword brandished. The steel blade descended in a savage arc, glancing off the vambrace of one of the Death Knights. Shouts and screams of panic rose from the spectators watching from their places of safety. Many turned their faces away, unable to bear what would happen next. The entire undead column turned their heads to regard the man, the crimson points of their eyes shining out from their helms and cowls and face wraps. Another blow came in with the man's return stroke as he shouted incoherently. The Imperial knights around them had their hands on their weapons but seemed uncertain about what to do, remaining where they were dozens of meters away. "Does that even hurt?" Ludmilla asked. The Death Knight looked over at her and shrugged. Ludmilla used her rear clip, activating life essence. She eyed the aura superimposed over the Death Knight, but it was difficult to tell if it was changing at all. After 30 seconds of repeated blows, she thought that the Death Knight's health had gone down by the barest amount. Ironically, the attacks were damaging the attacker more than his target. "Well," she said, "make sure he doesn't damage himself on one of those spikes of yours." She examined the crazed man's features as he continued to attack the Death Knight. Aside from his clearly disturbed expression, he had the build of a warrior under plain garb that might be found on any of the townsfolk. If compared to the Sorceress Kingdom's adventurers, he would be an iron-rank fighter considering his use of basic martial arts. A minute passed and the garrison captain finally came up behind the column to pull the exhausted man away. His long sword clattered to the ground, its grip bloodied by the string of frenzied strikes. "Erin." The captain gave the man a shake. His only reply was a beleaguered wail. "Are you familiar with this man, Captain?" "He's a retired Imperial Knight, my lady." "He looks far too young to be retired." "We were at Katza together," the captain said. "Some of the men, a lot of us still have nightmares, not all of us can just leave it behind, and some can't escape what they saw there." Her eyes went from the captain, who continued trying to soothe the traumatized man, to the priest standing far away. They were supposed to minister to the sick, but it appeared that their personal fears held them at bay. The man finally fell limply to the ground, moaning weakly as two Imperial knights carried him off between them. Lord Court stood watching with a helpless look on his face. Bitter feelings rose within Ludmilla at the sight of the young nobleman. A year ago, she had been in a similar situation. Because she hadn't harnessed her abilities yet, two men had died screaming silently in Bohadan's home from the very same terror. Others had stolen her ship and the rest fled to the theocracy, never to be heard from again. Ludmilla's ignorance and errors always seemed to exact a shallow toll upon her, but the world around her always seemed to pay an even heavier price in her stead. "I hope that the Count can make some progress with his subjects," she said quietly. "Yes, my lady," Baron Ward agreed. They resumed their procession down the street, leaving Court through its western gate. There, Ludmilla left the garrison troops, 2 Death Knights, 2 Death Warriors and 2 Death Priests, with the captain. Despite the grim scene that had played out as they made their way through the town, it was probably a constructive experience for those who witnessed it. The citizens and soldiers saw that the Death Series servitors wouldn't simply attack them even when attacked, and the Death Series servitors were able to measure the strength, or perhaps the fragility, of those they were to defend. With a long journey ahead of them, the aged nobleman led Ludmilla and the Death Cavaliers west down the highway. Ludmilla gave Courts and the men watching their departure one last glance over her shoulder. "There's one thing I still haven't figured out," she said as she brought her solita alongside the Baron's warhorse. "Count Courts appears to have inherited early. What happened to his father?" "Hunting accident," Lord Ward replied. "You could say that his stupidity killed him. And his brothers." "That's terrible," Ludmilla shook her head. "What could he have done to cause that accident? Was it a monster?" "No," the nobleman told her. "It wasn't an accident, it was an accident." Ludmilla stared at the Baron. The nobleman's expression remained as calm as it always was. "You'll forgive me if I cannot understand the full meaning of what you're saying, my lord." Lord Ward returned her look for a moment before his attention went back to the highway ahead. "I'm sure that you believe that a vassal should be loyal to their liege and fulfill their contractual obligations, that to be chivalrous is to be an extension of their lord's will." "Yes, I do." "Then in a relationship between houses, is a house loyal to their lord, or their lord's house?" "Ideally, a lord represented the interests of their house." Was he implying that the current Count Courts's father was not? For many, both aristocrats and commoners, the idea that one's title was hereditary was an essential component of the contract between liege and vassal. If all went well, families would be proud to say that they enjoyed a long, fruitful relationship with one another. If not, what would have happened if Count Courts's father had lived? Attainder, most likely. And his uncles? They would have pursued the matter of succession, Lord Ward said, which would have included the removal of the young Lord Courts. It was the old Count Courts, his grandfather, that arranged for it. To preserve House Courts, the heir of the house had been killed. To preserve the next heir, all potential pretenders had been killed. An entire generation was extinguished by the very man who had sired them. Assuming that it did in reality avert the fate of House Courts, it was the correct course of action, far better than arbitrary acts of attainder. Does the current Count Courts know about this? Ludmilla asked, who knows about the truth of the accident? That Count Courts's father was a blithering incompetent was a well-known fact. I'm sure everyone assumes he was disposed of. What of the consequences of murder? Not that anyone would have pressed charges, Lord Ward said, but the fact that the Emperor chose to overlook what happened means that he tacitly approved. If the matter was pursued by someone for some reason, the Emperor would likely have issued a pardon. His Imperial Majesty is a hard man, but that doesn't mean that he's cruel, blind or stupid. Service to the Empire is service to the Empire, whatever the form it takes, and that's why General Ray is allowed to do what he's doing. In short, the ends justified the means. General Ray carried out the 6th Legion's expeditionary mandate through his roundabout efforts to minimize losses to the Imperial Army by baiting his opponents into a highly defensible position. The 5th Legion carried out its defensive mandate by discouraging the 6th Legion from pursuing a strategy that put its jurisdiction and citizens at risk. Both army groups were serving the Empire, both were justified, by Imperial law, at any rate, in what they were doing. Neither side would give ground and the Emperor was silent on the matter. The Emperor and his court council had left the verdict in the hands of the Sorceress Kingdom, who had already left the answer to the Empire. In the end, the result would not be determined by the executives of either nation, but by the actors placed on a stage that had been prepared for them. As Baron Ward had noted, Ludmilla had arrived like clockwork, a catalyst to set events in motion. Shortly after midday, the Baron led them onto a well-traveled rural road running parallel to the east of the mountain where he had indicated the Arnstead mines were located. Ludmilla, still not quite ready for some other dark Imperial secret to be dumped upon her, eyed the nobleman's warhorse. "Is my lord's horse a bonded mount?" she asked, "or are you using magic items to sustain this pace?" "A bonded mount, my lady," the Baron answered. "We've been together for over 20 years now. I hesitate to ask, but is that Solita yours?" Ludmilla reached out and patted her Solita on the back of its bare skull. "It's a creation of His Majesty that was assigned to me for my tasks in the Empire. As far as I understand, summons and created beings can't be bonded." "That sounds about right," Lord Ward said. "I was curious what the mind of an undead being felt like, but I suppose that question will remain unanswered. Actually, I'm not sure what sort of house Zaradnik is. I assumed it was of a cavalry tradition like most of Riastai's, but your riding skills don't match." "We're rangers," Ludmilla replied. "Our territory lies on the border ranges south of Riastai's, but it's far wetter than the mountains here. And cooler. Horses aren't of much use when one's land is mostly dense forests, highlands and mountains." A few hours after they came off of the Imperial Highway, Baron Ward brought his mount to a stop at an empty crossroads. He gestured to the west, where a road made its way through scrub-covered foothills. "Arnstead and its mines are that way," he said. "About 10 kilometers. It's a large village of about 500, managed by a baron of the same name." "If it's that far away," Ludmilla tried to get a glimpse of anything in the distance, "why isn't there a village at this crossroads?" "The road marks the border, for one. There also isn't enough water here. All of the farmland is lower in the valley you see to the east. The rest is ranchland for horses, sheep and cattle. This is the northwestern point of my domain. We'll be at my village in about 2 hours." The Baron urged his mount forward again, leading them south along the road. It eventually curved southwest down the valley, leading through fields freshly plowed and sown. "What do you grow here, my lord?" "Nothing exciting, wheat, mostly. As Count Courts mentioned, it's been this way for over a century. We export our goods to Courts. Courts exports trades with Karlsheim and Karlsheim sends its taxes to our winter. Agricultural produce, ores and men, that basically sums up the contribution of the Wyvernmark to the Empire. From House Zaradnik's perspective, it's an enviable position. We could barely export anything and we were in a constant stalemate with the wilderness tribes. Speaking of which, How is your relationship with the peoples across the border? Lord Ward turned his gaze up the valley, where the winding river eventually crossed into a sparsely wooded area beyond the cultivated fields. I don't think it's anything out of the ordinary. If they're hungry, they raid. Otherwise, they stay out there. At least it's easy to spot things out here. What races do you have to deal with? Out of the usual ones, goblins and ogres. Trolls don't like the dry, but you can find them in caves that are everywhere and around small lakes out there. Things get nicer the further south you go, meaning it gets nastier in other ways. What we have here are the weaker groups pushed to what they would consider fringe territories. Is there anything one might consider unique to the area? Monsters or magical beasts? This is the driest part of the Empire, so you'll find things that you wouldn't elsewhere. Wyverns, giant scorpions, greater canyon tarantulas, rust monsters. She frowned at the mention of the potential threat to her equipment. As in armor goes boof rust monsters? You've heard of them? One of my friends encountered them on her promotional examination this year. We did have a group out here for that. My son was leading that patrol, came back in his britches. Who was it that you knew? Dimir Eriks. Baron Ward reached up and scratched his jaw at the mention of the name. Ah, he said after several seconds, the short girl with the big glasses. I heard she killed them, so she should have passed. She did, Ludmilla replied, though she still considers it a terrible experience. How common are rust monsters in this region? Worried that you'll be running around naked at some point? Yes. They're a priority for us to get rid of, but they always crawl out of somewhere. If your stuff is enchanted, though, you don't have to worry about them corroding it. That was a relief. Ludmilla was beginning to worry over how she would need to explain why she had lost the precious equipment that His Majesty had bestowed upon her. How do your patrols usually deal with them? Mages are the go-to. Barring that, we can use focused battle aura to turn our weapons magical temporarily, that way they don't turn into dust on impact. If all else fails, our spears get turned into staves and we beat them to death with those. Doesn't that mean the patrol with Dimir's group could have killed those rust monsters at any time? Yeah, but they wanted to make the students feel special. Got their stuff eaten for their trouble. Ludmilla wordlessly shook her head. Losing that much equipment would have sent most minor nobles into fits over the expense. When they came within sight of what Ludmilla assumed was Baron Ward's village, a pair of Imperial knights rode out to meet them. Like the men of the Second Legion when she first encountered them at the border, they did not falter and break at the sight of the undead column behind her. Captain, one of them said as they offered a salute. Welcome back. I may be mistaken, but isn't this the opposite of what you wanted? I didn't get anything out of Karlsheim, Captain Ward replied. Nothing's changed, but, as a consolation, I picked up Baroness Zaradnik here. Zaradnik. The Imperial Knight frowned. You mean the liaison officer mentioned in the briefing, sir? The same, Ludmilla smiled at his frown. I suppose consolation is technically not outside the realm of my duties as a liaison officer, but I'm sure I can manage more than that. She's arrived for an unofficial inspection, the captain told them. Any of Ray's men in there? Orensted's just got a new shipment of liquor, so we're probably in the clear for another day or so. Good. Go ahead and bring your troops in, my lady. We can get them situated at Gem. Can you set them up around the perimeter of the village? That'll be sure to scare the piss out of any of Ray's brats that come out to pester the village girls. Ludmilla went around to do as the Baron requested while he went ahead to his manor near the center of the village. A maid was awaiting her when she made her way over to the modest home of the venerable frontier lord. The rustic building was close to what she had dreamed of for her family back before the Sorceress Kingdom came and changed everything. After dropping her things off in a small room that used to belong to the Baron's daughters, she joined him in his hall where a table in front of the hearth was set for dinner. Do any members of your family still live here with you? Ludmilla asked. My eldest son is a captain in the same division, Lord Ward answered, so he comes by every once in a while. I have two other sons, one in the 3rd Legion and one in the 4th. One of my grandsons is around here somewhere, as well. It must be nice to have such a large family. They seem quite established. Some of them more than others. But that's enough about me. You've seen and heard a bit of what's going on here. Have you thought about what can be done? Telling Ray to run naked through the Katza Plains would be a good start. She was fairly certain that she could. Because the events were set into motion by Lady Albedo, However, Ludmilla had to consider the objectives of the royal court. Her assumption upon leaving the Dwarf Kingdom for her assignment was that the behavior of the Empire as a client state of the Sorceress Kingdom was being examined. What was going on in the Wyvern Mark, however, was distinctly different from the Second Legion's task in the northwest. Unlike the regular army groups of the Empire, the 6th Legion was an expeditionary force, one that would project Imperial power beyond its borders. General Ray's strategy represented an ugly aspect of the Empire that would rampage unchecked in the much easier frontier of the Wyvern Mark. I need to get the 5th Legion up to speed before examining the 6th Legion's activities, Ludmilla said. Anything that goes directly against the Sorceress Kingdom's official foreign policy will be stopped. Anything beyond that falls under the purview of Imperial law. You mentioned that General Ray was the only one doing this. How far is he along with his plan? Not very, Lord Ward replied. Ray's being pretty ham-fisted about it. Not that it hurts him. His little battalion of thugs is limited by how far they can strike in a day. Tribal populations near the border are sparse. He won't get the desired reaction out of them, and he's still not confident enough to begin advancing into the wilderness. If the 6th Legion advances 2 or 3 days past the border, Ludmilla noted, they'll already have claimed 5 times more land than the Empire can digest for the next 2 generations. That doesn't factor in all of the Empire's internal frontiers that will be consolidated in that time. Baron Ward appeared amused at her assessment. He looked up at the Wyvern head trophy hanging above the fireplace mantel. That's very Ranger of you, but the 6th Legion's stance is anything but conservative. They want as much as they can get, so their share of everything is that much larger. It used to be that being granted a barony was something only the most accomplished could earn. Now, every one of them is aiming to become the Empire's newest Margrave. It's less of a conquest and more of a competition. Ludmilla sighed. It was so characteristically human. Consumed by their ambition, they did not care about who they trampled along the way, including their own. Have you experienced any tribal retaliation so far? None, Lord Ward replied. As I said, populations near the border are too sparse. Ray's been too intense with his raids. Small tribes are simply obliterated and there aren't enough being displaced. He's refining his tactics, though. My rangers estimate that he'll be ready to advance south in under 2 weeks. It feels incredibly ironic that our desire to improve the domestic security of the Empire has whetted its appetite for foreign conquest. That's just how things are, the Baron seemed to shrug. You should understand that as a frontier noble, people settle in new lands and it's a long struggle to get things stable. If they succeed, things start to grow and prosper. When development gets to a certain point, expansion is the next order of business. In Riestais, Ludmilla said, efforts at expansion were limited to what little the local lords could afford. My house only got to that point after Erantal was annexed by the Sorceress Kingdom. Even then, I had sole authority over how that expansion was to be achieved. The existence of the Imperial army turns expansion into a different animal entirely. Thousands of competing interests are involved. With the centralization of power into monolithic national institutions came the ability to achieve more than any single aristocrat could ever hope for. Ludmilla once considered this a generally good thing, but she now realized that it had many faults as well. Just as the Imperial army shielded the Empire more effectively than any one noble ever could, it could also reach out to snatch up territory and resources with equal impunity. As Lady Albedo had so potently demonstrated, the will of Imperial society manifested in an irresistible wave that crashed into the borders of their frontier. A colossal surplus had accumulated, comprising the excess production, population and military might of the Empire. The nation screamed for this excess to be expended, to expand or die. Once enough of the pieces fell into place, the excellence of the Sorcerer King's Prime Minister was made clear. What was happening in the Wyvern Mark was an inevitability for any human nation that joined hands with the Sorceress Kingdom. Instead of waiting for the problem to manifest on its own, Lady Albedo had engineered a scenario to examine in advance, an experiment masterfully conducted on the scale of an empire. Ludmilla was unique in her experience as a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom. She was a frontier lord who exercised her full authority in all of its aspects while staying within the bounds of national policy. That experience would most likely prove invaluable here as she helped the Empire navigate its new reality. There were key differences in the Empire's systems, however, which she would need to wrap her head around before she could be constructive in her role.
I'm not sure if this is a question you can answer, my lord, she said, but assuming the 6th Legion secures a sizable strip of the frontier, what does it mean for the Wyvern Mark? It would depend on what the new land is used for, Lord Ward replied. As far as I can guess, the lower valleys will be used for agriculture and limited forestry. Mineral wealth will be the biggest prospect. The waterways aren't navigable by boat, so a road network will be a priority. The productivity of the Wyvern Mark will be redirected to support that expansion until markets reach a new equilibrium. My territory sits at the entrance to this valley, so trade will encourage new growth here. We'll have a town at some point, hopefully. A town for a barony, Ludmilla smiled. That's quite the dream. House Ward has held this valley since the Empire was a part of Rhea's ties. I'll have some unkind things to say to the Emperor if we get left out in the cold. So your main concern revolves around the fact that General Rey is attempting to provoke demi-human retaliation. The 6th Legion should be fighting its own damn battles, Baron Ward grated. What he's doing is dragging a whole other army group and innocent Imperial citizens into it. As much as Baron Ward appeared to be the exemplar of a frontier lord, he was also an exemplar of the Imperial worldview. A personification of chivalry who put the Baharuth Empire's interests first and was not bothered by the fact that outsiders were being treated as obstacles or objectives in their aggressive expansion. To what extent will the 5th Legion retaliate if General Rey succeeds in his plan to bait the demi-human tribes into attacking the border? It depends on the severity of the attack, Lord Ward replied. Normally, raids are conducted because a tribe's territory has been picked clean of food. When our patrols kill the raiders, the tribes have fewer mouths to feed. It's a problem that corrects itself, no point in risking men over a threat that's been quelled for another few years. Even if we completely get rid of a tribe, another one will move in, so it's not worth it. That's a sensible approach, Ludmilla nodded. Does this dynamic between the border territories and the tribes affect your poaching laws? Yes, hunting is encouraged since it means our neighbors have less to eat. Game competes with our livestock for grazing, so it's something we do anyway. Doing this makes the demi-humans more aggressive, but it keeps the numbers manageable by patrols. In short, small raids will be business as usual for the 5th Legion, so General Rey is trying to start a war. That's right. If a confederation of tribes hits us, dozens of villages will be affected and the 5th Legion will be obliged to eliminate the source of the threat. Rey's hope is that we'll deploy the Undead in order to preserve the lives of Imperial knights, but having the 5th Legion throw their weight into the arena suits him just fine too. Ludmilla shook her head at the callous stratagem being employed by the general. He was willing to risk upwards of 1 million Imperial citizens for the sake of his goals. Does the Court Council really have nothing to say about this? Surely there are laws. There are the rules and there are the rules, Baron Ward said. Rey is from a border house, but he went the way of a civilian noble. He doesn't see eye to eye with us. Everything is a political calculation and everyone under his influence is a tool to be used for his personal ambitions. The capital is willing to turn a blind eye to his conduct so long as he produces results. Everything becomes romantic when it happens a safe distance away, Ludmilla muttered darkly. A victory for the Empire, a tool for Imperial propaganda and a place to send all of the poor piling up in the towns and cities. In return, new territory will be gained and its wealth will flow to the centers of political and economic power. Indeed, my lady. In the grand scheme of things, the losses suffered by the people of the Wyvern Mark were negligible. From the central administration's perspective, it was a welcome price to be paid for exceptional long-term benefits. The problem was that this price was being forced upon one group for the benefit of another. For a frontier noble, it was an especially prickly issue. There was another group that would be paying this price, however. One that the Empire would certainly not consider of any significance, the tribes that they would be taking their new territories from. It seemed that a different sort of fight lay before her in the Wyvern Mark, one that martial prowess or cultural compatibility could not solve. What the 6th Legion achieved in the wilds across the border would set a precedent not just for its role as the expeditionary army of the Baharuth Empire, but also for how the Empire would structure its foreign policy. That foreign policy could not run afoul of the sorceress kingdoms. At the same time, she was expected to allow events to run their course. A line would have to be drawn somewhere, but Ludmilla still wasn't sure where it would lie. A young man appeared in the hall, drawing Ludmilla and Lord Ward from their discussion. He glanced at Ludmilla briefly before gesturing to one of the maids and taking a seat at the table.
Where are your manners, Joachim?
Baron Ward frowned. Don't tell me that a few weeks with Razorks have erased any semblance of civil conduct from your head.
Why are you dressed like a milksop, anyway?
It wasn't quite as flamboyant, but his attire did resemble that of the attainted suitors lying in ambush all over our winter. At least he didn't reek of cologne.
General Ray sent me to meet someone in Karlsheim, sir, Joachim replied as dinner was placed before him.
They arrived in the city 2 days ago, so I'm in a hurry.
For someone who's supposed to be fighting out in the wilderness,
word sure reaches him quickly. It's someone important.
The liaison officer from the Sorceress Kingdom.
Why the hell is he sending a cleric of the Earth God to meet with the liaison officer from the Sorceress Kingdom? It's because I'm a local noble.
Oh, sure, Baron Ward rolled his eyes. He spends all that time purposely not adding companies led by nobles to that battalion of his, and then he turns to one of us to.
What did he tell you to do?
Attend to her while she does whatever she's here to do.
Attend to her? The army doesn't pay you to be a footman.
Those are my orders, sir.
Is that so?
Well, good luck with that, I suppose. Joachim Ward cleaned up his plate and rose from his seat, hurrying out of the hall. Baron Ward followed his departure with a sour look. What kind of fool cleric doesn't notice that their home is surrounded by the undead? You didn't hide them, did you?
No, my lord, Ludmilla replied.
People have their heads up their asses all the time, he grumbled, but I never expected it from one of my line. Forgive me, my lady, but you may be attending to your attendant more than he'll be attending to you for the next few weeks. Ludmilla's gaze returned from the door to the hall and she offered Baron Ward a lopsided smirk. I'll keep an eye on him,
my lord. Much obliged,
my lady. It was a rare clear day when Zushiru's caravan made the final stretch to Elena, the easternmost city on the Golden Strand. In the depths of winter, the sun offered little in the way of warmth as the winds from the northern ocean endlessly swept over the landscape of muddy fields and orchards long stripped bare. They were better prepared for the weather than before, however. Fendros, Elise and Ida, who had at first traveled in fashionable city dresses, light mantles and stylish shoes, had exchanged their precious remaining luxuries for more practical options. They now had sturdy boots, comfortable woolen garb and heavy mantles that kept the wind and rain at bay. For some reason, they tried to imitate the militant look of Nemel's uniform, which was quite awkward for her. The Quagga, too, had slowly adapted to winter travel, though it was a long learning process for the subterranean demi-humans. At first, their experimentation was about as absurd as it looked. They would walk together holding a tent over themselves or try to use a tarp to shield them from the wind. This went on until, much to their dismay, a particularly windy day picked them all up and flew them into a copse of trees along the highway. After that, they tried to imitate human clothing, which was a challenge in itself. Very little sold in human cities fit them, hats fell off at their long heads, mittens would be shredded to bits and human footwear obviously would not work. Their proportions were just wrong when it came to everything, even shirts and pants. Staying in Norfolk for an extended period allowed them the opportunity to consult with various artisans over their woes, at least once they found those who were comfortable with demi-human patrons. The first and most obvious thing was fashioning fingerless gloves that could fit over their bulky paws and forearms. No one could figure out how to make working boots for their sharp-clawed feet, so they instead settled on a sort of covering for their lower legs. Wraps with long skirts replaced their loincloths and a garment that reminded Nemel of her father's belly warmer covered their abdomens. A warm shawl went over their shoulders and they brought long scarves to cover their necks and collars. It looked quite strange for the fur-clad demi-humans to be wearing clothes, but Zushiru and his apprentices seemed to be pleased with the outcome. The hooded mantles that they had brought with them from the Sorceress Kingdom went over it all, so it wasn't as if one could see anything anyway. As for Dame Verilyn, she continued to wear the beautiful dancer outfit that she always had. Being an adamantite adventurer, no one ever wondered if she was cold or uncomfortable. Her combination of beauty, power and talent was something people universally adored and never questioned. Their route took them up the rugged cliffs that dominated the northeastern coast of the Empire and the caravan slowed as they lined up to enter Elena. The city was built above a sheltered cove, divided into levels that led to its harbor. Nemel was enchanted by the unique scenery, but her newly recognized aide seemed more interested in the scrolls they had taken out of their cases to study. You must pull those out every time we stop for something, Nemel said. Why not enjoy the view while we're here? Liz's former territory is near here, Fenrose replied, so we've all been to Elena before. I get chills just looking at it. Chills? Nemel frowned. It's the way that the city's been built, Elise explained. The entire part below is basically a north-facing cliff, so it's cold there even in the summer. The administration and the upper-class district are on the top level and it gets poorer the further you descend. It might look interesting from up here, but once you know what's down there you won't ever see it the same way. Nemel eyed the gloomy buildings of Elena, then at the darkened roads between them. Many parts of the city were probably shrouded in shadow even at midday. The 4th Legion doesn't keep things safe? Nemel asked. They keep things safe like the 4th-class districts in our winter are kept safe, Elise answered. The upper levels and main route where goods are sent up and down the harbor are guarded by Imperial knights, but you don't want to be anywhere else. She had been to the 3rd-class districts in our winter before, but never the 4th-class ones. Even the idea that she might ever come close to the slums was enough to make her parents yell at her in fearful worry. Her curiosity over exploring the city squashed flat. Nemel eyed the scroll in Fenrose's hands. Which spell are you studying now? Mending, Fenrose replied. Going by what Lady Zaradnik said, we're going to be starting from scratch out in the middle of nowhere. Relying on imports to replace broken stuff will be expensive, so we need to stretch out what we have. Much of their time on the road was spent discussing how they would go from an undeveloped wilderness to their first functional settlement. It was a nostalgic feeling. As children, noble scions would often imitate their parents, pretending they were lords and ladies, imagining how they would develop their lands and what sort of people would live there. This, of course, would always end well. They would have handsome, charming husbands, big, happy families and all of their people would love them. And they would be rich. Unfortunately, as with many childhood fantasies, they faded away with their growing understanding of the world. Land was limited, men inherited first and they could only pray that the match made for them was someone decent. Now, all of the sudden, those fantasies were rekindled and they could dream again. Except there were goblins in those dreams. What about the proposals that Lady Zaradnik made? Nemel asked. Taking her up on one of them might work out better for the long term. I can see how it would, Ida said, but won't it take us away from our work? Also, I don't think we're cut out to be war wizards like you. As they were all mages, it was probably a given that Lady Zaradnik expressed an interest in hiring them for work in the city. The Baroness was nothing if not ambitious. She wanted to establish several service branches of arcane casters for the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom. Not only was she interested in war wizards, but mages of every specialization and vocation. Above even that, the Baroness was interested in hiring classroom instructors for the school system in her territory. That part was especially surprising, as magical curriculums were usually not incorporated into a noble's general education. Unless one was lucky enough to have a temple school accessible to their home villages, a commoner's education revolved around the family business and literacy was optional for many rural vocations. When it came to magic, one's family could either afford a tutor or a prospective student could look for an artisan who was looking for apprentices to sign on. Nemel had a friend who just happened to be lucky enough to grow up in the household of a noble scion who was learning magic and was allowed to learn magic alongside her, but the chances of that happening elsewhere were infinitesimal. The temples raised divine casters for themselves and the Imperial Magic Academy was an institution that, while nominally public education, was made inaccessible to most due to its exclusive entry requirements. Lady Zaradnik's plans were unprecedented in scope and exorbitantly expensive to establish and maintain. They were something that even wealthy nations could only dream about. The fact that a minor noble was endeavoring to do this single-handedly spoke volumes of her stupendously prosperous rule. I think Ray would be really good at it, Elise said. I agree. Ida seconded. She has that talent, after all. She has a talent? Nemel looked over at them. What does it do? Ray can sense magical ability, Ida said. You mean like the talent that Arch has? Fenrose made a face. It's not the same as Arch's, she said. We compared in our talents back in the academy, hers was so much better than mine. She could reliably sense things at will. My talent only works some of the time, it basically comes down to luck. But that matters less as an instructor, right? Ida raised a finger. When it works, it's not wrong. If you're teaching a class, you'll be seeing students every day. Eventually, it will work.
I guess that makes sense.
Fendro's voice remained dubious, but I'm supposed to be helping everyone out with the new land. Lady Zaradnik said that there would be an office for each of her domain's territories in her capital. One of us is going to have to work there to handle things on that end. Warden's Vale is supposed to be a day downriver from where we're going to be. It's not a distance we can casually go back and forth over if we're needed. Shouldn't Miss Gran be the one in the office? Having an aide stationed in the capital while the one in charge is living in a bush seems backwards. Would she be living in a bush?
No, she would at least have a tent. Still, that did sound backwards, and it wasn't quite right, either.
Nobles who administered developed territories divided their time between their territory and their liege's capital. Dame Verilin's territory had no development, however, and frontier nobles tended to stay in their lands. Did that mean she had become a frontier noble? She didn't feel like she could rip trolls in half with her bare hands yet. We barely know anything about the Sorceress Kingdom, Nemel said, so we shouldn't assume things work the same way there as they do here. Once we get a better idea of what's going on, we can consult with Lady Zaradnik over what our best course of action will be. She has that rule about not doing things you aren't supposed to be doing either. Aside from planning and organizing the tenants, we won't have much to do at the start. The queue crept forward and it was sunset by the time they reached the gate. 2 Imperial knights eyed the group of 3 noble women, an Imperial officer, an astonishingly beautiful adamantite adventurer and 5 suspiciously shrouded mole beastmen. After some consternation, one of them settled his gaze on Nemel. "Are you together with this group, officer?" He seemed to realize how strange the question was as the words left his mouth. Imperial officers generally did not attach themselves to merchant caravans unless they were part of the highway patrol and usually for limited stretches of their journey. Nemel did have a uniform that identified her as a member of the highway patrol, but it was that of an aerial mage from a jurisdiction in the opposite corner of the Empire. "It's a long story," Nemel offered the man an embarrassed smile, "but I am with them."
"Yes.
Master Sharu has all of the relevant paperwork prepared in advance."
"Master Sharu?"
A clipboard popped up from the side. The Imperial Knight stared at Zusharu's claws before gingerly taking the documents in hand. He flipped through them for a moment before looking over his shoulder and calling for the mage in the customs office. "If everything's in order," he said, "this won't take a minute." The customs inspection moved from wagon to wagon and, as the soldier had mentioned, did not take very long. They rolled through the gate and Nemel looked up at the lead wagon's driver. "Do you have an inn in mind, Curtis?"
"A handful," Curtis replied.
"Things don't look too busy yet, so we probably got a few to choose from. You want to drop your things off at the plaza first, Master Sharu?"
"Yes please, Mr. Curtis."
With the expansion of Zusharu's stand came many comforts, but also the inconveniences of having a larger operation. The foremost issue was that there was so much to move around. A pavilion and furniture also needed to be leased in each city they stopped in. At the end of the day, Zusharu and his apprentices, as well as the caravan staff, had to move their inventories from the pavilion to a secure place overnight. Then they had to move it back in the morning. Nemel supposed that this was to be expected for a traveling merchant with so many wagons, but it still felt annoying to have to deal with. Zusharu seemed more pleased at his success than annoyed at the amount of work they had to do, so it was probably just her. They offloaded everything to the curious gazes of onlookers around the plaza who were drawn by the large procession of merchants that had latched onto Zusharu's caravan. She wasn't sure if it was accidentally stumbled upon, but it was an ingenious scheme where all of the merchants traveling together combined the traffic they generated to increase sales at every stop. Plazas of course were places where this naturally occurred, but, by this point, they had figured out how to position everything to maximum effect. Zusharu's stand occupied the center of the formation, as it contained all manner of things. The pavilion was well lit and heated by magic items, which attracted people in droves and caused them to linger. Fendros and her friends were able to wear spring dresses in the warm interior, which further enhanced the experience that they offered. Efforts were made to collaborate with food stands, entertainers and every business that was willing to cooperate to create a strange sort of trap for the citizenry at every stop. As Nemel watched them work, Dame Verilyn started to wander off. And by wandering off she really did do just that. In every new place, she meandered everywhere attempting to experience everything in her curious frost dragon way. She would start from the tent being set up by familiar people, walking back and forth and all around them. When she was comfortable enough, she would begin to explore further away, eventually disappearing to places unknown. Nemel went to catch up to her liege before she lost her. "Will you be doing work for the Adventurer Guild tonight?" she asked. "Yes," Dame Verilyn answered with a nod. "I'm excited over what sort of commissions they'll have. There's this thing I have to ask about, as well." Dame Verilyn produced the strange gold coin with the head of a human minted upon it. She had shown the coin to Nemel and the others a few cities previous, but none of them knew anything about it. Supposedly, it was something from a vast nation that once spanned both sides of the Azalizia Mountains. At first, Nemel thought it might have belonged to old Riastais as it did fit the description. Dame Verilyn, however, mentioned that there were many coins like it in the royal vault of Fioburkana, which had been sealed since the coming of the demon gods. The region around the blister had some unique architecture that the locals claimed was from before that time, but, thus far, Dame Verilyn was unable to find anyone who recognized the coin. "In that case," Nemel said, "I'll see you in the morning. Please take care of yourself."